Hello, it is Ryan, and we could all use an extra bright spot in our day, couldn't we? Just to make up for things like sitting in traffic, doing the dishes, counting your steps, all the mundane stuff. That is why I'm such a big fan of Chumba Casino. Chumba Casino has all your favorite social casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere with daily bonuses. That should brighten your day a little. Actually, a lot. So sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com. That's ChumbaCasino.com.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18+.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to part 2 of this mini-series on Stop the Tall Man, Save the Tiger. For more on Peter Young and his writing, you can follow the links in the episode description. But for now, here is Peter Young.
There's a really tender moment between you and your wife when she arrives home. You weren't expecting her to come home with your son from the hospital, and that was a really tender moment in the book. And I think that is what makes the writing so compelling. You have this love story at the beginning, and you have these real human moments that are real, that people experience. These are things that people have felt. Those moments where, when you describe what it felt like for Paige to come in for that hug that you have when she gets back from the hospital, it's those moments that are relatable for, I imagine, every reader, despite the experiences that you have later on as a result of Uncle Robert's influence. But what that does is allow people to recognize that this can happen to anybody. This can happen to any single person. And it was tough getting through to the end of the book, because I just wanted to sit Paige down and say, come on, what are you doing? Which I recognize is it's not always the correct response, because we have to have compassion and sensitivity and understanding. But sometimes when you feel like not all parties are practicing those things, that you're like, come on. So you are experiencing some difficult things as a partnership. Paige is going through these other things that you're not entirely aware of at that time. What is it that starts to change between Paige and Uncle Robert, and between Paige and yourself as time goes on? Because it's almost like she's in a relationship with two people.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple key moments. So, obviously, with the birth of my second son, David, at that point, it's very clear looking back that Paige is absolutely 100% totally devoted to him. And she would give up her life to protect Uncle Robert. Okay. And I probably didn't know that at the time, but clearly looking back, I can see that was the case. So then what happens about a year later is we all remember 9/11. And I remember where I was during 9/11. I had, because I grew up in New Jersey, I had, a high school classmate who was widowed on that day. I had classmates in the buildings that got out. So I obviously have strong feelings about 9/11. So a couple months later, maybe about a year later, we're there with Uncle Robert again at another conference. And he's talking about 9/11. Somehow it came up, and he said, 80,000 people died on that day. And I thought, I've heard a death toll around 3,000. And somehow it got on to politicians. And he just, in a very dark, menacing way, Truman was a Jew, as in President Harry S. Truman, and Roosevelt, as in FDR, was a Jew. And just the way he kind of spat it out with such venom. And I was shocked. I didn't say anything to him at that moment, but I remember that living room, I was stunned. And here's this guy that my wife reveres. And I'm like, so that night, we're downstairs, the kids are asleep. I'm like, honey, here's what this guy said. I don't think we should have anything to do with him. And she had a very concerned look on her face, didn't say much, and probably just left and went to go brush her teeth or something. And I didn't follow up. I didn't say, wait a minute, are you comfortable with this guy, with what he feels? Obviously she was. And she didn't probably want to have this kind of showdown at the moment. And I look back, I think, well, what would have happened if I had pressed the issue, if I had continued and said, wait a minute, hey, while he leaves, John and Christine, Michelle's parents, Paige's parents, what do you think, about this guy and all his thoughts? And, they probably would have ganged up on me at the time. So then at that moment, I thought, wow, what have I gotten myself into with this guy? I never doubted my relationship with Paige, never doubted my marriage to her at all, like literally ever. Never. Not even this moment do I doubt that it was the right thing. But then the conferences started. So we would go to Northern Idaho and have conferences where it'd be my family, Uncle Robert, Paige's parents, and we would literally just sit and listen to this guy talk for hours. Some of it was just crazy off the wall. Some of it was borderline brilliant. Some of it was really good. A lot of it was odd. And it was all really directed on him. And so it was very slow, Keith. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but it was a very slow progression to where I realized he was more of an influence in her life than I originally thought, if that's even possible, but he was. And slowly but surely, as I would spend, more time with Paige and her family than with all of my extended young family who lived far away, it was just so much more immersion into the world of Uncle Robert. So where there were some things I thought, well, yeah, this guy's brilliant. I totally agree with him on this point and on that point. But then, over here, I'm going to try to forget about that. And it was a very slow progression until I realized that all these years, after being married 17 years, would that be 17 or 16 years? 17, that Paige still didn't think I was a Christian. And so we went to one of our conferences. And at the conferences, he would kind of set the agenda, which was basically, I talk, you listen. But beyond that, it was, here's what I'm going to talk about. And on this one conference in 2015, everybody was to give their testimony of how they became a Christian. And, at the end of the couple of days there, I realized that, most of the adults there would tie it all back to him. And I was the outlier. I was the only one that wouldn't tie my faith journey back to him. It wouldn't begin with him, but with everybody else it did. And Paige wasn't buying it. She just didn't believe me. And so after 17 years of marriage, 17 years of trying to have my wife love and adore and revere me, her husband, like she did another man, and constantly hearing about how brilliant this other man is, I finally just caved. And I look back at that moment when I caved. And I said, I must not be a Christian, and there were tears for both of us. And I remember we went inside, we were going to tell Uncle Robert, and oh, wow, this is going to be great. And in that moment, what was going through my mind was, well, maybe this will be finally the key that allows our marriage to be the way I've always hoped it would be, to where she would truly, truly love me and revere and honor me and not another man. It wasn't like, well, I'm finally going to be a Christian now. No, that really never entered my mind, as odd as that sounds. It was, okay, now I guess I've finally joined the right way, and I'll have the marriage I've always wanted.
Robert didn't explicitly tell each of you that you couldn't attend traditional church. So there were times where you and Paige would go to different churches to practice your faith in the more traditional sense of being part of a congregation, as opposed to sitting in somebody's living room and listening to Uncle Robert. So I wondered if you could just talk the listeners through what that looked like and how that changed as well.
So let's say when Paige and I got married, we first lived in Boulder, Colorado. So we went to a Presbyterian church, very large church, left after a year. And then we moved back to Pocatello, lived in a tiny town called Ingham, but I'll just call it Pocatello. And we went to a very traditional Presbyterian church. This is Idaho, and it's Mormon country as well. So it would be, fairly conservative. And it was a small congregation, many older people. And that's what I was used to. And was the pastor brilliant? Did I agree with everything? No. He was a nice man. He tried. So then we switched from that church to a smaller church, but a very similar feel. It wasn't any particular denomination or anything, just a small church. Again, pastor was a good guy. But, was he a dynamic leader? Nah, probably not. But again, when I go to a church, the leader's not the pastor. The leader's Jesus Christ. If you think the pastor's the leader, you got a problem. So then, in all of these churches, the pastor just never stood a chance because, Paige would then relay everything to Uncle Robert, and Uncle Robert would say, well, here's why the guy's wrong. And then Paige would relay that back to me. And I'd be like, well, we might not all agree on everything, but that's part of the process of being believers and humans, is that if we disagree, well, now the Lord is kind of forcing us to try and get along, right? Work it out amongst yourselves, kids, right? So then we moved and then to another small town about 2 hours north, and we joined a tiny little Baptist church, which is not your typical like Southern Baptist, but a little Baptist church, very small. Again, there was an elder pastor, was a wonderful man. I think Paige kind of liked him a little bit. And then, but he was interim. And then we had a full-time pastor, and this poor kid, just fresh out of seminary. And Paige just did not have any respect for this poor kid. And he was in over his head. And, again, so now what I'm telling you is a progression of, let's say, maybe 10, 12 years. We've left all these churches. And so I get the feeling like, Paige did not want to set foot in this church again because of what this young pastor had done, which it wasn't egregious, but, again, he was a little wet behind the ears. So I look around the West for preterist churches, which is basically a way of saying, that eschatology has been fulfilled already. And there was like two, one in Montana, one in Northern Idaho. And so we checked out the one in Montana. We just showed up one day. And I fell in love with it because, politically and theologically, we were a match.
Step into the world of power, loyalty, and luck.
I'm gonna make him an offer he can't refuse.
With family, cannolis, and spins mean everything.
Now, you wanna get mixed up in the family business.
Introducing The Godfather at ChumbaCasino.com. Test your luck in the shadowy world of The Godfather slot.
Someday, I will call upon you to do a service for me.
Play The Godfather now at ChumbaCasino.com.
Welcome to the family.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
And there were a couple families. They all homeschooled and they worked together, and they were hardworking men. And after every service, we'd get together and we'd eat and we'd talk. And what do you think about this? I disagree. Really? You disagree? Why? Okay, that's okay. We can still be friends, And I was gung-ho. I thought, this is great. I finally found a church home. And I was hoping and praying that Paige would feel the same way. So after going there for probably a few months, Paige's parents came down. And they didn't come down to attend church with us and hang out and make friends. They came down to interrogate everybody. It's pretty obvious. So they initially focused right on the kind of the patriarch of the church, and just grilled him with questions over and over and over again. And then, of course, immediately, I think they were there one night or two nights. Maybe they stayed with us. I'm sure on the drive home, they were calling Uncle Robert. Yeah. And, well, here's what the guy said. Oh, well, here's where they're wrong, this, and this. And then we had an election sermon in Montana, maybe a couple of months later, where right before the state legislature is sworn in early January, we got to go to the state capitol building in Helena, and we basically had like a little mini sermon, and then had like a little conference afterwards. And I invited Paige's parents and Uncle Robert to show up, and they did. And it wasn't oil and water from the get-go, but it soon got there. And of course, Uncle Robert picked apart everything about these people because he had to. Because if Paige and I are looking to other people for answers or support or fellowship and theological questions that we need answers to, well, if we're doing that, then it's a threat to his rule, to his reign, to his dominion and dominance over us. So, of course, he had to squash it, which he did. Paige and our children came to despise the church, despise the people there. And in fairness to my children, they did that because that's what their mom and grandparents, maybe I didn't tell them outright, but they could tell. So we stopped going. We stopped going to that church, and that was it. It's the last church we ever went to.
After you stop attending church, Uncle Robert has some type of revelation where he believes he's figured out what America's true churches really are. And it was just, I never would have, if somebody would have said, like, put money on what you think that is. And I realized the irony in what I'm saying.
Right.
I never would have been able to guess. So I wondered if you could just let us know about that little nugget of gold that Uncle Robert dropped on everybody.
Well, before I drop it on you, what's funny, there's a lot of funny things about it, and odd and sad and crazy, is that I had been around this idea for so many years that when I told, I think it was one of my sister-in-laws, who I had been talking to for a while, this is after everything, broke, my Paige had left me. She said, "What?" I said, "You didn't know that? I hadn't told you that?" She said, "No." So it was Paige's parents would go down to Southern California. They taught. So in the summer, they had time off and they would go spend time sitting at the foot, of the master and soaking in everything Uncle Robert had to teach them. And I always knew what they talked about because as soon as John and Chris would come and then stay with us in Idaho on their way home, that's all they could talk about was everything that Uncle Robert had been drumming into their heads. So again, there's another one of those moments where John is standing really close and he said, casinos are the true churches in America. I'll say that again, just in case you thought I had misspoken. Casinos are the true churches in America. And all the churches that everybody goes to on Sundays, those are absolutely worthless. You're wasting your time. Casinos are the true churches in America. And he said it with such conviction. I thought, Peter, be careful. Don't say anything. Don't get yourself in trouble. Don't ask too many questions because you're not going to change his mind. I said, okay, interesting. And then as he described it, he said, well, anybody can go into a casino, regardless of your race, religion, creed, your bank account, your success in life, and be blessed by the Lord. Okay. But when I go into a casino, and I don't go in there much. I mean, I think I've been in a few times that, played blackjack, whatever. I see people worshiping money. I see desperation. I see people that are down on their luck and they're being duped into thinking that this is going to save them economically, that this is how they're going to make a living, that, they have barely enough money to pay their rent or whatever it is. And they go gamble. And listen, the house always wins. You and I know that. Everybody knows that. The house always wins. They give you free drinks at a casino because they always win, right? So you can go to a casino and have fun. That's fine. Go ahead and have fun. And you can win some money. But really, casinos are the true churches in America? I tried to keep my thoughts on that one to myself because I knew that if Uncle Robert said it, Paige was going to believe it. And she did. And then they also called it, so in addition to it being a church, which I saw people worshiping money, they also called it the office. And I think this maybe sprung out of a desire to not let all of our young kids at the time know where they were going. So where Paige's parents live, there is an Indian casino, 45 minutes away, hour away, and they would go there all the time. So we'd have our conferences, and the adults would go to the office every night, and they knew I didn't want to go, so I stayed at home to watch the kids, and they would go to the office. And they literally would call it the casino their office, which again makes sense because I never saw Uncle Robert work. I never saw him or heard him talk about a job. He never had a job, never had gainful employment that I know of. His wife did. His wife had a good job. She paid all the bills. So for him to go and gamble at a casino and call it his office, as crazy as it sounds, it kind of makes sense. But that's just one other bizarre twist to all of this.
It is Ryan Seacrest here. There was a recent social media trend which consisted of flying on a plane with no music, no movies, no entertainment. But a better trend would be going to ChumbaCasino.com. It's like having a mini social casino in your pocket. Chumba Casino has over 100 online casino-style games, all absolutely free. It's the most fun you can have online and on a plane. So grab your free welcome bonus now at ChumbaCasino.com. Sponsored by Chumba Casino.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
Sorry.
It's okay.
When you realize that Paige's father has met this con artist at a vulnerable time in his life, and that person has perhaps used Paige's father's faith and weaponized it in order to manipulate him and subsequently his entire family to come. It does also make sense that a con artist might spin things in their favor to convince everyone this is the true church. I need you to fund my time in this true church so that I can continue giving you the theocratic information that you need, the answers to questions that you have, the guidance that you require from me after he has cultivated that dependency over all of those years. It's a very clever thing, really, to convince everybody that that's the case.
So over the years, we would tithe to Uncle Robert. Now, when I say we, I say Paige and I. So when we first, got married, we probably would send him a bit of money every now and then. But I would also tithe to, let's say, our local church or to other organizations. There's one called Prison Fellowship where they take the gospel into prisons. I've always wanted to support them and other groups like that. And then over the years, that percentage that went to Uncle Robert was like this, and it got more and more until eventually we sent all of our tithe money to him. Paige's parents sent all their tithe money to Uncle Robert, and I would imagine Paige's older brother, who had a good job, sent all of his tithe money to Uncle Robert. And then Uncle Robert, whenever he would go on his trip, so he would go to DC, and supposedly he would go meet with congressmen, senators, and representatives, and share his wisdom of what is going to save the world from nuclear annihilation and what is going to save the world from international communism. And we'll get into that later, what that specifically was. But whenever he would go on these trips, he would stop by casinos along the way. And again, in America, most of the casinos are either in Vegas or like it's Atlantic City, New Jersey, or they're on Indian reservations where they're allowed to have them. So he would stop by all these places and he would gamble. Now, again, it's very slow and subtle how all of this happens. We're talking a 20-year time period. But I remember talking to a good friend of mine from college, explaining all this, and we had many conversations, after the fact. And she said to me, "Wait a minute, Peter, you guys all sent your tithe money to this guy, and he gambled all the time." And there was a pause on the phone, and I said, "Ooh, when you say it like that, it doesn't sound good, does it?" And I could look back at it now and kind of, it's kind of like gallows humor, laugh about it. But at the time, it was serious. I mean, this is his office. We have to fund Uncle Robert's ministry. And Uncle Robert is going to go talk with senators and representatives. And before the Gulf War, he wrote a letter to Saddam Hussein, and he's trying to intervene on the world stage. And I didn't buy all of it, but I thought, well, maybe this guy maybe he is meeting with all these senators. Maybe he's a first name basis with all these people. And then it was my lawyer, finally after the fact was like, "Peter, did you ever see him meet any of these people?" Like, "Well, no, I didn't." And, I was always uncomfortable if somebody would ever say, "Well, this guy was a con artist." But now, after all these years later, it's a good description. It fits.
Were your family ever aware of the situation around Uncle Robert? Not necessarily the difficulties that you and Paige were experiencing, because I know you were very private about those as you were kind of going through the motions of separation. But your family, your parents, they would come and help when there was a newborn, if there were periods where there were hospital stays. Your parents were present. So I wondered how aware they were of this kind of figurehead in the other family.
Well, good question. So I think when we got married, obviously all my family was there, and most of the Clauses were as well, because the breakup hadn't happened. So they, Uncle Robert spoke at our wedding. Now, it was Paige's real uncle that married us, but Uncle Robert spoke, gave a little homily. And I learned after the fact, again, when Paige left me, it was many years later, that, one of my brothers and his wife almost walked out of the ceremony because of what he said. I can't remember what he said, but even back then, they knew how weird this guy was. So my parents and my brothers and sisters-in-law all would have known of Uncle Robert. They wouldn't have known hardly anything about his theology. They just would have known of him. They would have known that I now believed in preterism and past fulfillment, which is, again, to me, that's not a salvation issue. That's an issue where we as Christians could sit down over a cup of coffee and, okay, tell me your Bible verses to support it, and I'll tell you mine. We'll have good talk, and we're still friends afterwards. So they knew that. But beyond that, they probably didn't know much of anything else. So thus, all of these wild, revelations come out. So when Paige left me, it was January 14th, 2017, she basically told me in a letter, don't tell anybody. Don't tell your parents till we can talk to the kids. Don't tell the school or anybody in the community, because the two older boys are still going to high school. And, and I'm terrified. of her and Uncle Robert. I've been totally emasculated and dominated by these two because I'm trying to save my marriage. And so then I obeyed her to as best I could. Didn't tell anybody. I didn't tell my family that she had left, taken the 3 youngest kids, and was now calling me the devil, by the way, until 4 months afterwards that she had left. And so nobody in my family knew. And so I called him. I called all my brothers on the phone to call my parents. And, they didn't know. I think my dad certainly had an inkling that it all went back to this Uncle Robert guy. And I know he did. I know he had an inkling. But then what really kind of got the spigot wide open on all the evidence, let's say, was that I would get an email from Paige or Uncle Robert, and I would just get sent to a tailspin. Now, again, at this time, I'd lost 30 pounds. I couldn't sleep. I was never suicidal, but I was an hour away from maybe checking myself into the hospital. I was a wreck. And I'm trying to still be a dad to the 2 older boys, who one's in college, one's in high school, and never let them see me cry, just try and maintain a good face on all this. And they weren't talking to me at all because they believed their mom 100%. So then I would get these emails and I would just be, a wreck. And so then I would start sharing them with my lawyers, with my brothers, with another friend. And they would get these letters, these emails from Paige and Uncle Robert. And of course, they saw right away, immediately, this is a problem. And I'm like, really? Oh, well, that's a problem. Oh, yeah, Peter, that's a problem. So they saw it right away. And they then intervened. And I have a loving family. Are we perfect? No. But, one of the brothers flew out right away, like maybe a week after I called him. He flew out. Another brother flew out a couple months later to spend about a week with me. Yeah. So again, they all found out real quickly just how bad it was. And they didn't know. They knew there was this weird guy, but they didn't know the extent of it. Nobody did.
It's interesting that there was only one of Paige's siblings who wasn't shunned. And that person in your memoir has a very distinct presence and personality. But he's also male, so I wonder if that played into it a bit as well. But could you just tell the listeners a little bit about what Jack was like around Uncle Robert and his role in sort of supervising private one-to-one meetings between you and your wife? He was always with her, accompanying her. It was very strange.
And I apologize, Casey, but because in the book, I changed everybody's names, to kind of protect their privacy. So are you talking about Paige's older brother or her father?
Paige's older brother, Jack.
Okay, yeah. Well, so he was the one, other than Paige, that still revered and followed Uncle Robert. I don't recall him ever doubting it. I don't think he believed Rebecca at all. When she had her revelation that, this guy is something we shouldn't follow. So he was always there. He would film all of our conferences. So he was kind of the technical guy that would film everything. And at the time, he also had a very difficult marriage that eventually broke up, and had a lot of issues, during that marriage. And his ex-wife never bought into Uncle Robert. So I'm sure there was a lot of tension in their household. She did not want anything to do with him. And that was pretty
funny
obvious.
how the marriages have problems when the spouses don't fully buy into Uncle Robert's teachings.
Well, and Uncle Robert's control was partly through guilt and shame. And would he control Paige through guilt and shame? Yes, but his guilt and shame was very effective when it came with the men, right? So, Uncle Robert, of course, has done everything perfect. He's only sinned once in his life. And Paige's father and older brother and I, we're not perfect. We've had some, let's say, a little bit of checkered past. And he was able to really manipulate that well, along with, discussions around the Bible, to then just heap the shame on us, like how worthless we are, and then also elevate him. Well, I've done everything perfectly. I've done it all perfectly. And if you read the story of Adam and Eve and everything that went wrong with human race, I've done it perfectly, but you guys, clearly, he wouldn't come right out and say it, but it was implied. And I remember sitting in some of these conferences thinking, oh, my Paige must just think I'm the worst human ever. And there were many occasions where Paige's father would, be in tears over, being in the presence of the brilliance and the perfection of Uncle Robert, and it would magnify all of the things that he did wrong in his life.
Step into the world of power, loyalty, and luck.
I'm gonna make him an offer he can't refuse.
With family, cannolis, and spins mean everything.
Now, you wanna get mixed up in the family business.
Introducing The Godfather at ChumbaCasino.com. Test your luck in the shadowy world of The Godfather slot.
Someday, I will call upon you to do a service for me.
Play The Godfather now at ChumbaCasino.com.
Welcome to the family.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
And that was awful. Put it bluntly.
It has to have a significant effect on you if you're seeing your father, one of your primary caregivers, reacting to a man in that way, presenting himself in that way. There are parts where Paige's brother Jack would be on his knees and, really revering Uncle Robert by his feet. But there's a very strange part in the book, and I wonder if this is why Paige's sister was shunned and why Jack wasn't, and why Paige was kept so closely at Uncle Robert's side. And that's the part where it's suggested to Paige that she tie the two families together. Do you think that was Uncle Robert's intentions from the get-go? And could you just talk us through that particular part of your experience?
Yeah. Well, it was Paige's father that was the one that was on his knees in front of Uncle Robert. I remember that specifically. It was at one of the conferences, and he was sitting right next to me. I think it might have actually been the conference where we shared all of our testimonies. And he was reading from his notes, and he was so distraught. He starts, crying and sobbing. He gets up, walks across the living room, and gets on his knees and puts his hand on Uncle Robert's hands, and Uncle Robert just sits there and soaks it in. And most of the people would say, listen, thank you, but I'm not your savior. I didn't do anything. I might have helped you along the way. Oh, Uncle Robert soaked it in, and Paige's father just cried these tears of anguish. And I was uncomfortable. Oh, I thought it was so awkward. So then when Paige came to me and said that she wanted to be a surrogate so that Uncle Robert could have a biological male grandson, again, I was stunned, I was angry, terrified that she might actually go through with it. I don't think it was Uncle Robert's idea, and I don't think it was her father's idea. Clearly, they loved it. I don't know if her parents ever knew. Uncle Robert certainly knew. She told me first, then she told Uncle Robert. Paige did. Uncle Robert of course, thought it was great. But Paige, because to her credit, needed my buy-in, and I did not want to buy in at all. So what happened was Uncle Robert had two boys, and they got married, but they had daughters, or they had adopted boys, so they did not have a male to carry on Uncle Robert's precious bloodline. And so Paige saw this as something that needed to be rectified. And at the time, she's, I think, 40, 41 maybe. And the last thing I wanted to do was have our families tied to this guy. So she was going to have be a surrogate for the older of Uncle Robert's two boys, and who I'd met once. We'd never met his wife, ever. So, who knows if the guy would even want to go along with this. But Paige was absolutely determined that this is something that she should do. So I do think it was her idea. But again, when I say it was her idea, well, how many of her ideas really spring from a soil that's independent from Uncle Robert? Probably none. They all find their root, let's say, in the teachings of Uncle Robert. So even though it was her idea, it's because all of her ideas have been incubated in a world that's run by Uncle Robert.
And at this point, Paige is at a certain age where it could be very dangerous for her to have another child.
You would think. So what I did is I started I started doing a bit of research and, going online, is there ways that, she's not even allowed to do this? Is it legal to, try and do this at a certain age? I think in California it was illegal. And then I started to try and think of all of these logistical reasons that we should not do this. And I remember asking her, I said, are you going to have sex with this guy? She said, no, we would do it in vitro. Okay. Well, what if you have a daughter? Would you do it again? Yes. What if you had 5 daughters? Would you do it a sixth time? Yes. But don't worry, Peter, the Lord will provide. Okay. And what makes the story even more poignant, at least for me, and harder to deal with, was we had 5 kids at the time, and we had talked about having a 6th. We were going to name him Matthew. We'd already named him, and that's what we were going to have. And it wasn't like, we were really planning for it, but it was something that got bantered back and forth between she and I. And clearly she was having reservations about having another child with me because I was too immature. So then she said to me, after she had told me that she wanted to have this surrogate for Uncle Robert to have a male bloodline continue, she said, I will not have Matthew with you until we at least offer this to Uncle Robert and his son. Otherwise, we're not having Matthew. And I remember being stunned by that. And told it to Uncle Robert. And again, the irony of ironies is that in the end, it was Uncle Robert who said, and Paige took a vow. She said, I took a vow before the Lord that we will not have another child together until I get to do this for Uncle Robert. So there was Uncle Robert that said, well, Paige, as a wife, you shouldn't have done that. And so Paige didn't go through with it, not because of anything I felt or said or did. It was because Uncle Robert told her not to do it. So the idea kind of went away. And we never had Matthew. And the idea of having a surrogate did come up one other time about a year later. And that was after the conference where I was supposedly saved by Uncle Robert, where I was, just beaten down by him, finally caved. And then later that day, I'm like, really? Like, I was never a Christian my whole life. Like, I'm almost 50 and I've believed in the Lord my whole life. Like, really? Okay. So then a couple of weeks later told Paige, I said, listen, if you really want to go through this and have a child and be a surrogate, go ahead. I'm not going to stop you. And she was like, well, I'm not going to do it unless you're fully on board. Well, that's not happening. And so it went away. But at that point, the closest in our marriage, it was downhill, and it kept going downhill.
So you having this experience or making an admission that you have been saved or born again, or Uncle Robert has helped you realize that you were, one way and now you're a different way. It felt in the moment like it might fix some things,
yeah,
but it didn't heal any of those wounds that had started to appear in your marriage.
No. So again, in that moment, in that conference, everybody had given their testimony. I gave mine. Paige didn't buy it. And the testimony I gave was totally tailored to try and convince Uncle Robert and Paige and her parents to back off and just let them believe I was a Christian. It had nothing to do with my testimony, really. So Paige didn't buy it. And so then, I get convinced I'm not a Christian, although I immediately had doubts, like, really? And I wrote a letter and sent it to my parents and my brothers. And I'm sure they probably rolled their eyes like, oh boy. And so that would have been in 2015. And yeah, I guess Paige maybe just never believed it. And so the next year we had a conference again in June 2016, and we bring it up all over again. And Paige doesn't believe it. And so if Paige doesn't believe it, of course, Uncle Robert is going to defend Paige, because they are one. They're always on the same page. They're always, thinking the same thing. Oh, well, you must not be. And so, really? Oh my gosh. And we end that conference, and I'm beaten down. Like, what do I have to do? And I just feel like my marriage is slipping away. My life is slipping away. What is going on? And even then, though, when I say marriage slipping away, I never in a million years thought she would leave. Ever. I thought maybe this will just be, we won't be very close, but she'll never leave. So then a few months later, we had what I describe in the book as the Butte ambush. So Butte, you have to get a little background to Butte. Butte, they sometimes call it Butte, America, because you had all these immigrants pouring into Butte in the late 1800s because they had discovered, gold, silver, and mostly copper. And so Butte has this wild, ribald history, a lot of Irish there. And again, it kind of still has this, very frontier Western feel to it. So we meet at this dumpy, miserable, flea-bitten hotel because Uncle Robert and Brother Michael are driving through, going somewhere, who knows where. So Paige's parents come in, Paige and I drive over, and we meet there in this dingy, dark little cave. And it's like a torture chamber because Paige starts out, Uncle Robert's in the front of the room. Paige says, yeah, I don't think Peter's a believer. Okay, here we go. And so for the next hour or so, Uncle Robert's asking me questions of what I had done in my life, the things that I had done wrong, the sins that I have committed. I was completely faithful in my marriage, literally never even thought about having an affair. I love my wife, which was something that some of the other men in that room could not say. But as a college guy, I sowed my oats. We'll say that. That's all I'll have to say. So I didn't have a perfect life. Nobody has. So we're dredging all of this up. So about an hour in, I'm as worthless as the dust on the carpet on this filthy room. And I know it's coming. I know it has to happen. I know it. I'm just waiting for him to get there. And finally, as I'm, in tears, and all the other people in the room are just sitting there quietly listening. No one's defending me. No one's standing up saying, wait, come on. Nope. They all know where it's headed. So finally, I guess I must have lied to you guys last year. Didn't really do it. Not a Christian, not saved. So we go through the motions again. And now Peter's finally saved. And that's like an hour in. And at one point, though, while he's still berating me, while he's still beating me into a pulp, he says, I would crawl on my hands and knees 1,000 miles to be with Paige. An odd thing to say for a married man, don't you think? But in that room, none of us thought it was odd. And it was just another example of, well, Uncle Robert's brilliant. And Uncle Robert is so compassionate. And Uncle Robert would have said that to Paige's dad. And he would have, I would walk 1,000 miles on my hands and knees to be, with your wife, Kathy, and nobody would have thought it was odd. Because if it was odd for anybody else, it was never odd for him. So he says, if you want to leave now. And he points to the door. If you want to leave, go ahead and leave. And I remember thinking it was such a bizarre comment. I'm not going to leave. And I look back at it now like, who the hell are you to tell me that? But everybody in the room was waiting for my answer. So I had to say, no, I don't want to leave. So then we prayed and I became a Christian, I guess, finally. And the attitude of everybody in the room was kind of like a year before, it was with tears of joy. Well, Peter finally sees it. Uncle Robert's finally saved him. He finally got it after resisting all these years. Now it's kind of like, oh, geez, he pulled a fast one on us. Is it for real this time? There was certainly less joy in the room, which again, the Christian life, the Christian faith is all about joy, and we are joyful when we know that we're a child of God, right? Like, wow, that's pretty amazing. And well, where was the joy in that room in Butte? Wasn't there. And it was sick because everybody in that room was sick, including me. We were sick in the mind.
That is the end of part 2 of this mini-series. For more on Peter's writing, you can follow the links in the episode description, or to get in touch with me, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com, or follow me on Twitter and Instagram at cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, host of the Cult Vault Podcast.
Step into the world of power, loyalty, and luck.
I'm gonna make him an offer he can't refuse.
With family, cannolis, and spins mean everything.
Now, you wanna get mixed up in the family business.
Introducing The Godfather at ChumbaCasino.com. Test your luck in the shadowy world of The Godfather slot.
Someday, I will call upon you to do a service for me.
Play The Godfather now at ChumbaCasino.com.
Welcome to the family.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.